Hey everyone, Delve here. Today I'm going to go over the skill Mysticism in Oblivion, and how you can actually beat the entire game with mostly Mysticism. Mysticism is not usually on the top of people's lists when they think about skills that can be used to deal damage to enemies, and I think it wasn't exactly intended for that purpose. Nevertheless, it can be done, but it will require some good knowledge of the game, as well as at least one support skill, that skill being Restoration. One thing about this character is that I will not be using Illusion as this character. In previous videos I've relied upon Illusion pretty heavily because it's the best skill in the game, but obviously I want to branch out and go over different ways to do spellcasting. Now some would say that Restoration is the best skill in the game, but in my opinion it's actually the worst skill in the game, purely because of how hard it is to level. Nevertheless, it is an extremely powerful skill when used correctly, and can enable all kinds of wonky spellcasting that otherwise would not be possible. So for that reason, this guide is just as much a guide for Restoration as it is for Mysticism, and we will probably also need Destruction as well for this to work, at least in a handful of scenarios. Starting out, once again we'll want to play as High Elf. The bonus magicka is extremely crucial for this character, to the point where I don't even recommend Breton. Ordinarily, Breton is better because of the resistance to magic, but in this particular case, we desperately need the extra magicka, and without it, we could struggle to get this character off the ground. It's probably possible with Breton, but we won't actually even need the magic resistance anyway. Another nice thing about High Elf is that, of course, we can just run through the entire tutorial. For Star Sign, you have exactly one choice, that being the Tower. The reason is very simple: we need the reflect damage effect for custom spells, which would be essentially impossible to obtain otherwise. It can be obtained very late into the Shivering Isles questline, but obviously we would need a way to get that far into the questline, so our only real option is the Tower unless we feel like using Conjuration or something else to get there. The setup for this trick will take noticeably more time than the usual setup, so I don't recommend bothering with that. Instead, just take the Tower. For our class, I went with Alchemy, Alteration, Armor, Destruction, Illusion, Mysticism, and Restoration. Mysticism, Restoration, and Destruction are not optional. Alchemy is also highly recommended, but not technically required, depending on whether or not you are willing to make use of a gold exploit or farm gold in some other way. Alteration has some limited uses, such as lockpicking spells, and also levels up really quickly, which we will want. Same idea with Illusion. We won't be using Illusion magic, but it does level up very quickly, which will help us to level up our character. Finally, Armor. This is another skill I thought I may need, since we are going to equip some pieces of armor. It ultimately was not, as our equipment pieces won't even be damaged really. So you could replace this with something else if you wanted to, according to your preferences, although it's a good skill to take in general, as there does come a point with many characters that it is useful, depending on how much you are playing the character overall, which is why I tend to like taking it. But now that we are out of the tutorial, it's time to talk about Restoration, Destruction, and skill trainers. Many skills in the game are slow and difficult to level, with Restoration maybe being the worst in the whole game. Other terrible skills which you'll want to consider trainers for include Light Armor, Heavy Armor, Armor, and Block, but Restoration is the worst, being so slow to level that the fastest way to level it is to farm gold and pay trainers to bring you all the way to 100 skill. The key trainer for Restoration is Mars in the Bravil Chapel, and she can only train you up to 70 skill, which we will absolutely need. Next door in the Bravil Mages Guild is the key Destruction trainer, Delphine Jend, and we'll probably want to hit 70 Destruction with her as well, although we won't need any more than that. We'll need to go all the way to 100 skill with Restoration, however, so you'll want to prioritize that. To go from 70 to 100 though, you'll have to complete a quest, which I'll go over later. The first question is how to get the gold to pay for these trainers. There are lots of exploits that can be used to farm infinite gold, but for this particular character I just used Alchemy. Now, you do not have to use Alchemy, but Alchemy has some other serious bonuses that help this particular character along. Specifically, using Alchemy will help us level up, which we will need and want, as we'll want to be at least level 25 for this character. Alchemy also helps us increase our intelligence, and lastly, it does give us the opportunity to use magicka potions, which can be decently useful depending on how you want to handle the character, or as a backup in case we need more magicka later. Magicka management is crucial for this character, and magicka potions can make it a little more consistent, but at some point I no longer really needed Alchemy anyway. I already went over Alchemy for making gold a little bit in the Marksman video. How that works is that you can go to inns and buy food ingredients, make potions, and turn a profit. It's a quick loop, but it's not as gold efficient as some other strategies. A better strategy overall is to go to farms and gather food ingredients. While we're doing that, we can add other locations into our farming loop to get our hands on ingredients that we can use to restore magicka potions as well. The loop I recommend starts in Wayne Priory, where you can find steel blue Entaloma and green stain caps. You want to save the steel blue Entaloma for later, but the green stain caps can be combined with food ingredients to make sellable restore fatigue potions. Just down the road is the Odile farm, and here you can conveniently harvest various food items, including a single unit of flax seeds. From here you can go down to the Skingred stables, where the nearby cereal vineyards can be harvested for huge numbers of grapes. Probably not as quick as resetting the Odiel farms, but also nearby to both fields are a good number of flax seeds, with some near both roads leading into Skingred. Note that this is a region I got some ridiculous game crashes in, so maybe don't be standing directly on top of flax plants, and also don't run directly through the grape plants either. That seemed to reduce my character's speed for no discernible reason, and that happened to me a few times. Once you've harvested both spots, you can then grab some more steel blue Antiloma from the Talus District Plaza in the Imperial City, before heading to the main ingredient in the Market District or to any other alchemy vendor, where you can then create and sell a bunch of potions. From there, you can go to Frostcrag Spire, wait 3 days, and then repeat the loop again. This will allow you to rapidly increase your alchemy skill, and each loop will bring in about 2,000 gold. Once you hit 100 alchemy, you can brew potions using only a single ingredient, which will roughly double your gold income to about 4,000 gold per loop. This is why I recommend saving the steel blue Antiloma and the flax seeds, so you can get stronger magicka potions and more of them when you do hit 100 skill. But you can also consider making and selling them, depending on how you want to approach the later section. While you go throughout the process, it's very crucial that you don't just level up as you go, because you are only allowed to use trainers 5 times per level. So it is very crucial that you level up only when you have already leveled up your restoration skill 5 times with Mars at the Breville Chapel. Because restoration is such an abysmally slow skill to level, I don't recommend bothering to cast the spells as you go. Instead, I recommend spamming Mysticism spells, so you will of course need your Mysticism at 100 skill to cast the spells we're going to want to cast. As you do level up, you'll of course want to focus on Intelligence, Willpower, and Endurance as stats. Once you've hit 70 Restoration from a trainer, and 100 Mysticism and Alchemy, one additional thing you may want to consider would be at least 50 Destruction as well. To fully flesh the trick out, we'd ideally have 100 Restoration, and that's not really optional. So at 75 Restoration, it's just a suboptimal way to do things, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. You can still technically do them at 75 Restoration. And as long as you don't have 100 Restoration, what we can accomplish with the skill is significantly more limited. To get to 100 Restoration, we'll need to rescue the Master level trainer from Kvatch, which means closing the Oblivion Gate, and then we'll also have to clean out Kvatch Castle as well. Assuming we are high level, this is actually a fairly difficult task, but with Alchemy and the right mix of custom spells, it is in fact possible. Although you will need to farm out the remaining 5 levels of Restoration to be able to actually make the custom spells you want. The substance of the trick is actually fairly simple. What you do is you fortify your magicka with a bunch of custom Fortify Magicka 100 point spells, and then you cast a bunch of high cost spells from Mysticism, giving yourself effects like Spell Absorption, Reflect Spell, and Reflect Damage. Now this will not be sustainable with a willpower of only 100, but because we leveled Alchemy and farmed Restore Magicka potions, we can use those to enable us to juggle all of these buff spells. The main problem with Restore Magicka potions is that they restore a flat amount of magicka per potion, meaning that if you fortify your magicka total higher and higher, the rate at which you restore magicka will seem to slow, even if you drink 4 potions. But with 100 Alchemy and Journeyman level Alchemy equipment, the potions you make should be sufficient. For your Fortify spells, you can do Fortified Magicka 100 points for 70 seconds, or 60 seconds if you want to add on 100 points of Fortified Willpower for 3 or so seconds. I do not recommend this. I think probably just a Fortified Magicka is good enough, and that's really the key bottleneck, Magicka Regeneration, which is why I recommend getting to 100 skill. Nevertheless, because we can drink 4 Restore Magicka potions and regenerate around 44 magicka a second, it's technically not necessary to advance past 75 Restoration skill, and our limiting factor only becomes how many potions we have on hand. Once you've fortified your magicka into the 600 to 700-ish range, you will then be able to cast a large custom Mysticism spell. I recommend around 100 points of Reflect damage for 30 seconds, as that will give you complete immunity to melee attacks, and will reflect damage back onto the enemies. Unfortunately, this damage is affected by the difficulty modifier, so your reflected damage will be pretty poor on max difficulty. Fortunately, you can stack multiple different copies of these spells on top of each other, so you can cast 2 different 100-point reflect damage spells for 30 seconds, and reach 200% damage reflection, and so enemies will take twice as much damage as they did before. Reflect spell is going to be a bit tougher to actually use, because it's significantly more costly in terms of magicka. Even Spell Absorption is more expensive than Reflect damage, so I went with around 100 points of Spell Absorption for 15 to 20 seconds, and that was kind of sufficient as long as I was absorbing spells, but the duration is a little short. All told, I had 3 spells of 100 points Fortify Magicka for 60 seconds, 2 100-point Reflect damage for 30-second spells, and a 100-point Spell Absorption spell for as long as I could afford. You can add as many Fortify Magicka spells as you like, but because you are relying on potions for Magicka Regen, it's probably not worth it. The way to use this is fairly simple. You can cast your first Fortify Magicka spell, you drink 4 Restore Magicka potions, and then you cast your remaining Fortify Magicka spells. At that point, you should have enough magicka to cast your huge custom reflect spells. And then before your fortify magicka spells expire, you cast them all again and repeat the cycle. The timing on all these custom spells can be a little awkward, but it is in fact possible to beat the Oblivion Gate and clean out Castle Kvatch with this character. Another nice thing about spell absorption is that it makes it much easier to keep the loop going, as enemies will basically give you free magicka pretty consistently, so this works best when surrounded by huge groups of enemies you can slowly work down. If you kill enemies one at a time, it will usually cost you around 8 mana potions per enemy, so killing a large number of enemies is more efficient on your limited mana potions. For any quest that doesn't technically require you to kill all enemies, you can of course also simply run past the enemies, as you are immune to most physical and magical attacks, as long as you can keep juggling the spells, which is harder than you'd think when you are constantly being attacked. Unfortunately, after I had all this set up, I actually experienced a really interesting bug where my game crashed and all my character-specific additions disappeared, so all my custom spells were deleted, all my custom potions, and all my custom enchanted items as well, which was luckily only a single item I enchanted with a sigil stone. Now, this was probably just as well, as to be honest with you, this was an extremely poor and aggravating way to do things. And it's not only difficult to maintain the juggle of all these spell buffs, but of course you need to constantly be farming up the magicka potions as well, or dupe ingredients or something like that. Luckily, there is in fact a better way, I just hadn't thought about it until after the fact. Instead, you can simply complete the first Oblivion Gate and the battle for Castle Kvatch while you are still level 1, and it becomes much easier. The only thing you'll need is a spell to heal an ally, so the basic convalescence spell you can buy in any chapel will work, and from there, as you go throughout these quests, you can simply heal your allies. The main issue comes with the Oblivion Gate, as it can be tough to keep the guard you find near the entrance alive. Also, the level wasn't really ever designed around this premise, so you may get awkward scenarios where he isn't able to successfully fight. The main issue being the stunted scamp on top of this rock. You have to somehow lure the scamp down to fight him, as otherwise he'll be trapped trying to run up to the scamp. So they didn't really test that out. And then lastly, some of the caster Dremora enemies will summon higher level scamps, as in the non-stunted variety, which can prove an issue for him as well. So you may need to reset a whole bunch of times to get lucky, as combat is unpredictable and he can die in all kinds of stupid ways. And it doesn't help, it can be extremely difficult to aim your healing spells at him, but when you get to the top of the tower, you can of course also just use him as a distraction, run past the enemies, and grab the sigil stone. If he dies, you could consider just finding a bunch of fire salts and then making a flame Atronak at Frostcrack Spire. You could even also make a frost Atronak, and render the entire quest a joke probably, if you are struggling with it, as you can find a good number of guaranteed samples of frost salt throughout the world. Liberating Kvatch Castle itself is pretty easy, and it's a fairly straightforward quest, and you'll also get tons of reinforcements who will happily cut through the weak Dremora and stunted scamps. Inside the castle are the higher level scamps, but by this point you should have enough of an armada of troops that it's not going to be an issue. Once that's completed, the master level trainer at the Kvatch camp will then train you up to 100 restoration. The problem of course is that you'll still need an absurd amount of gold to get there, and the quickest and easiest way to do that legitimately would be to use Alchemy. But there are also plenty of exploits for infinite gold as well, which I'll go over in future videos, so Alchemy is optional. With that being said, we may still need to be high level to fully kit this character out, so you wouldn't be saving yourself that much trouble, in my opinion, even if you did dupe yourself a bunch of gold. But on to the full version of the trick. Now that we have Restoration at 100, we'll want a series of spells that fortify magicka 100 points, and fortify willpower 100 points. And by all means, you can get as fancy or utilitarian as you want with this. For example, my spells were 100 points of both magicka and willpower for 60 seconds, and I had 8 of them total. This is on the utilitarian side of things. Now, this spell costs 320-ish magicka, which is more than the 300 I had with High Elf at 100 intelligence. So I also included an additional spell that fortified magicka 100 points for 60 seconds, with fortify willpower for only 10 seconds, and then that springboarded me into the remaining 8 spells. It takes a while to get the whole array of buffs going at once, and I do recommend refreshing all your spells before you move on to casting other spells, just so that your magicka buffing spells all have approximately the same duration, and that way it's easier to keep track of. The main fear with this strategy is that your buff spells start expiring, or you are attacked by enemies while unprepared, which could very easily leave you vulnerable. For this reason, Alchemy is still kind of nice to have, as Restore Magicka potions can either help you kickstart the buffs, or help save you if your buffs aren't active. When all is said and done, you'll have 1,000 magicka that rapidly regenerates. And you can of course cast a 100 point Reflect spell for 30 seconds, and as many Reflect damage spells as you can afford to make. For Reflect damage, over the course of my whole run I added them as I went, again 100 points of Reflect damage for 30 seconds, and as you add them and stack them on top of each other, enemies will start to die pretty quickly. To some of the later spells I made, I added 100 points of Fortify Willpower for 20 seconds. Not sure how much it really helped, but it probably didn't hurt. 6 spells like this is more than enough to handle any melee enemy. You could of course also add more buff spells if you wanted to, and ramp into buff spells with a longer duration, such as spells with a duration of 120 seconds, so that you have to refresh them less. This would be nice because it would be less execution intensive. Be aware that making custom spells costs gold, and the more expensive a spell is to cast in terms of magicka, the more it costs in gold to actually make that custom spell. So you'd end up making a whole lot of spells just to ramp, and the ultimate cost would be tens of thousands of gold, on top of the tens of thousands of gold that you've already spent on custom spells and restoration and destruction training. So for me personally, it wasn't worth it to ramp too much. Again, I went with 1 spell to get me to 400 magicka, 8 spells that were 100 points of magicka and willpower for 60 seconds, 1 spell that was 90 points of reflect spell for 30 seconds, and only 2 or 3 reflect damage spells at 100 points for 30 seconds, and I added more of those as I went. Now, my setup is about as utilitarian as you can get in my opinion. You probably could get a little more utilitarian, and you definitely could get a lot fancier, but this is the way that I did things. Against many enemies, this will be a sufficient setup, such as enemies like ogres and most Daedra. For enemies like zombies, vampires, and wild animals, you may want to consider spells or potions to cure disease. Most of these diseases are annoying as opposed to actually harmful, but the astral vapors disease from dread zombies will prevent you from regenerating magicka. So you will need something if you plan on fighting those enemies, although you can usually just ignore zombies as they are quite slow. Caster enemies are another issue, and it has to do with damage. When it comes to melee enemies, 300 to 400% reflect damage is good enough to wear down most melee opponents quickly enough. Unfortunately, adding more reflect spell doesn't increase the damage of reflected spells, and they are also affected by difficulty modifiers. So even killing an enemy like a lich can be a serious hassle and can take several minutes. But since you have essentially limitless mana, you can of course just cast weakness spells on them. Weakness to magic 100% for 30 seconds costs very little magicka for this character, and can be lazily stacked on any spellcasting enemy. This is just one of those things you're going to want to do on most spellcaster enemies, as otherwise killing them will just take forever, and it's nearly required on enemies that heal themselves, like Spider Daedra. It also doesn't matter if an enemy reflects it back onto you, because as long as you have enough reflect spell, their damage spells will never affect you anyway, so there's nothing stopping you from just casting it freely, and if it gets reflected, it doesn't matter. Your only other real option would be a powerful custom absorb health spell. I recommend 100 points for 1 second, and for a character like this, the cost will be essentially nothing. You'll also never be able to cast a spell like this without 100 restoration, so if there's any time to try to make use out of absorb health, this is your moment. You can sit there and spam it on enemies and burn them down quickly enough. So this is a pretty decent solution to enemies that heal, and even just many average enemies if you feel like it. The downside is that this cannot be used against enemies which reflect spells, so liches are a great example. If you try, they will reflect it back onto you, and you will damage yourself and heal them. Well, actually you can, because you can give yourself 100 points of resist magic from custom restoration spells as well, and that's actually pretty cheap. Spell absorption will not work, however. You cannot absorb spells that enemies have reflected back onto you, which is pretty funny considering I'm almost certain that enemies can absorb their own spells if you reflect them, so that's a little unfair, but it's just how it is. Either way, absorb health is obviously a less efficient way to do things than weakness stacking against any enemy casting spells. To deal with spellcaster enemies, I also did mess around with absorb magicka, drain magicka, and damage magicka. Unfortunately, all of these are essentially worthless. Absorb magicka didn't seem to do anything at all, and didn't prevent Spider Daedra from healing. Drain magicka could be usable, but it would require 100 destruction skill to even cast any worthwhile spells, and for some enemies you'd need 4 or 5 custom spells to drain all of their magicka, so I wasn't willing to go through the effort of using it. Damage magicka seemed to work. Unfortunately, you can't make custom spells with damage magicka, so you're stuck with the default spell. In practice, it seemed to be less effective than spamming an absorb health custom spell, so I can't recommend that or any of these. Now you could get a sigil stone enchantment with damage magicka, but at that point you can get sigil stone enchantments with silence, and either way you'd have to hassle with soul gems to use an enchanted weapon. And that's really the crux of the problem with all of these. If any of these were alternatives to silence, they might be okay, but as it stands, all of them are just worse than silence. Even if any of these did work, lots of caster enemies can't or don't want to melee attack you, so unfortunately there's no real substitute for weakness stacking in my opinion. And the last enemy type worth going over is archer enemies, as in enemies with bows and arrows. Reflect damage doesn't affect range damage, so even with 100% or more, enemies with bows will still deal full damage to you and take no damage in return. Fortunately, they'll tend to switch to their melee weapons when you get close to them. I did have a few scenarios where the AI bugged out and they wouldn't, so you may want to bring an absorb health spell or another damage spell of some kind just to deal with them. Breaking their bows with the disintegrate weapon spell kinda worked, but it involved transitioning a bunch between the doors until they finally decided to pick up a melee weapon. You can also cast a shield spell on yourself out of the Alteration School to reduce the damage they deal to you, if that's something you feel like you need, but it was never something that I bothered doing. Next, I'm going to go over equipment with powerful enchantments on it that you can find and equip to make this character slightly more convenient. Specifically, equipment pieces with Reflect Spell and Reflect Damage on them, as these are quite powerful effects for just about any character. Reflect Spell in particular is annoyingly magicka intensive to cast, and there's also a lot of items in the game that can give you some. We'll start with the Ring of Namira, available at level 5. The ring grants 10 points of Reflect Spell and 12 points of Reflect Damage, and the quest itself is extremely easy to complete, although you may be attacked by enemies like bears or ogres on your way to the location. Next is the Spellbreaker, available at level 10 at Peryite's Shrine. It's a fairly typical Oblivion crawl with Daedra enemies, but you also don't actually have to fight a single one of them. You are just searching for the ghosts of the Peryite followers. This quest and the Ring of Namira quest I completed at only 75 restoration, and it was a huge pain, and going forward all the remaining quests I completed were at 100 restoration. You could very easily use invisibility to complete both of these quests, either via illusion or alchemy. Next up is the Mundane Ring, which can be found as random loot from some enemies in Obliviongates, but can also always drop from Raven Cameron in the Imperial Sewers. This provides you with a whopping 35% Reflect Spell, alongside 50% Resist Magic as well. Note that you must be level 22 to get this to drop from him, so if you need to level up more, you can take Conjuration, Alteration, and Illusion as major skills, since these skills can be leveled up rapidly by spamming weak spells. And of course, Alchemy is a great option as well. The last item we'll need to reach 100 Reflect Spell from items is the Ayleid Crown of Netalata, which if obtained at level 25 or higher will have 25% Reflect Spell on it. This is from a fairly lengthy questline, but we can make it pretty quick if we want. The first thing is that we have to give Umbacano 3 Ayleid statues, and Umbacano's house can be found in the Imperial City's Talos district. The Ayleid statues can be found in 10 different ruins across Cyrodiil. The easiest 3 are Kulat, southeast of the Imperial City, Phenakis, north of Cheydinhal, and Ninindava, northeast of Coral. I recommend consulting the UESP wiki article covering this topic, as there is an extremely handy map as well as maps of the interior of the ruins themselves. Once you've brought these statues to Umbacano, he'll send you to one more ruin to obtain an item, and when you bring that back to him, he'll send you to steal the helmet you're after from another house in the Imperial City. The house you are looking for is in the Imperial Garden Elven District, and I was able to steal the helmet extremely easily with lockpicking spells. The version you steal for this quest, however, has relatively poor stats, with only 8% Reflect Spell, so you'll need to hand it over to Umbacano and continue the questline. From here you'll go to one last ruin, full of extremely dangerous undead, and you can just let Umbacano get killed by the undead and loot the crown off of him, although perhaps you can actually finish the quest as well if you want. Either way, with all those items equipped you should now have 100% Reflect Spell. There's one more Reflect Spell item of note, although it's not necessary for this particular character, and that's the Ring of Sunfire that can be obtained from the quest Order of the Virtuous Blood. And it will have 25% Reflect Spell on it as long as you are level 25 or higher. It also has some bonus disease resistance on it, which is quite nice for this character. Unfortunately, the math just doesn't work out for it. Mundane Ring gives you 35%, Spellbreaker gives you 30%, Ayleid Crown of Netalata gives you 25%, so you can only equip one more ring, and you only need 10% more, and so Ring of Namira is sufficient. But I guess, if you want the disease resistance, or you have some other set of Reflect Spell items, it's worth considering. Now, Reflect Damage items aren't quite as common as Reflect Spell items, but Reflect Damage also stacks infinitely, so there are some pieces of equipment you can consider. With that being said, I think on the main they aren't really worth the effort, especially compared to Reflect Spell. The first one is the Raiment of the Crimson Scar, which can be obtained by buying all the dumb expensive items for Deep Scorn Hollow. The best version of this can be obtained at level 25, but the questline is bugged and you'll always get the level 1 version. So to get the level 25 version, you'll have to hit level 25, disable the DLC in the data files menu on game startup, then you reload your save file, and then you go back again into the data files menu and re-enable the DLC. You may want to copy your save files in case something goes wrong, but for me it was just fine, except that I had to walk around a bit before the quest triggered again. And then of course you'll still have to pay tens of thousands of gold buying all of the items, and it'll be in a dresser in the bedroom. Unfortunately, the item is actually kind of terrible, because it's an armor set and so it decreases your spell effectiveness. The thing about spell effectiveness is that it reduces the actual effect of the spell, so a 100 point Fortify Magicka spell, for instance, would only fortify your magicka by 85 points, assuming you had a spell effectiveness of 85%. So unfortunately, equipping any armor, including Spellbreaker or the Alien Crown of Ninalata, decreases your ability to fortify your magicka. For me, this was a worthy trade-off, just so I didn't have to constantly reapply Reflect Spell, but there is a strong argument to be made that none of these armor pieces are worth it at all, at least for this character, as equipping them will give you less magicka and willpower from your buff spells. For the Raiment of the Crimson Scar in particular, I think it just isn't worth equipping, and same goes for just about any armor pieces that have reflect damage on them, as it's just not that expensive of an effect, at least for this character. Still, a potentially interesting item for another kind of character, as it does make you 35% immune to all physical attacks. Another one worth considering would be the Escutcheon of Coral, a shield that you can get from the Sins of the Father quest, and it will grant you 35% reflect damage as long as you are at least level 25 when you get it. Obviously, you'll have to unequip Spellbreaker to equip this, but some enemies don't cast spells, so it's not the worst idea in the world, but also totally unnecessary for this particular character. It's also relatively heavy, and the questline isn't that short, but definitely an option, especially for another kind of character. One item that would definitely be worth equipping would be either the Necklace of Swords or Amulet of Axes. These are random loot pieces you can find out in the world, assuming you are high level. Not at all worth farming for, but I did get lucky and I did find one in some treasure, and it's nice because it's a necklace, and so it doesn't decrease your spell effectiveness, nor does it interfere with any of the reflect spell items I've gone over thus far. Now that our character is optimized, we can talk about the Great Gate and Paradise. Ordinarily, the Great Gate is a huge pain, but for a character with 1,000 magicka, casting a big custom healing spell for a long duration on the defenders is a pretty good way to do things, and because I did this, I actually had a surprising number of them survive, including Joffrey, who almost always gets killed for me, and this would actually be a great way to do things as any other type of character, except that leveling restoration is totally impractical. Next, we'll go over Mankar Cameron. Tragically, there's not really a convenient way to beat him without weakness stacking on him. With Resist Magic 100 points for 30 seconds, I was able to work him down a decent amount with Absorb Health spells, but it was a rather laborious process that I cannot possibly recommend. By contrast, he'll struggle to survive more than a minute or so if you commit to weakness stacking on him. I did try a bunch of other things to kill him some other way. If you are willing to silence him using Illusion, you will also have to break his staff using Destruction, and that's actually really easy to do as staves have really low durability. Although, he can reflect your Disintegrate weapon spell back at you, and if that causes your weapon to break, you'll unequip it and also Spellbreaker, because shields require having a melee weapon equipped as well. So that's something you will have to be prepared for if you try to do that. But you could of course also reverse pickpocket a bound dagger onto him to increase his melee damage, and he will in fact melee attack you if he has no other options. And then that way you can try to kill him while he's silenced like that, but that wasn't something I was personally willing to do, although I think it would work. Of course, if you have an alchemy skill of 100, you can also just hit him with a damage poison and he will die rapidly. I'll cover poisons in a future video, so I'm not going to say more about them or alchemy itself now, but it is important to note, and that would almost certainly be the easiest way to do things, probably even easier than weakness stacking, which is saying something. So kind of a funny catch-22 there, that by grinding alchemy to 100, we've kind of rendered this character itself sort of obsolete, which is kind of a funny foible to it. And that's Oblivion on max difficulty focusing on mysticism. It wasn't too bad actually, if a little tedious. It goes to show what can be done if you're willing to make extensive use of restoration, with the sky being the overall limit, and I'm sure it could enable all kinds of wonky spellcasting, maybe such as destruction without weakness stacking if you wanted to try that. This would probably be the way to make that happen. Of course, it was much slower to get off the ground, and in the end it truly was reliant upon weakness stacking to actually beat the game, but we did technically reflect the spells back, so I guess it still counts in my mind. And other than that, I found it to be really fun and interesting. For the rest of my guides, I probably won't be making use of restoration. I think I've covered the skill in pretty good depth, especially since it is so cumbersome to use, and I think I'm done with Illusion too as well. Lastly, I'd like to give a special thanks to the Old Knight, as well as the UESP and fandom wikis. Without the help of all these sources, these guides would not be possible. And thanks for watching.